Good afternoon. Welcome to Ryerson Democracy Forum. My name is Mohammed Lashimi. I am the President and Vice Chancellor of Ryerson University. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I'm very pleased to welcome our panelists for today's forum. Ontario Minister of Labour, Monte, McNaughton. Hassan Yosef, President, Canadian Labour Congress, and Ryerson's Peggy Nash, Chair of our Center for Labor Management Relations. Thank you all for joining us today. Over the years, Minister McNaughton and the province of Ontario have been great partners with us, supporting the development of homegrown, highly skilled talent here at Ryerson University. And through his leadership of the CLC, Hassan Yosef has been working to ensure a just and fair transition for workers and communities affected by a changing world. As Peggy Nash knows well, we at Ryerson understand that post-secondary institutions will play a real role, a major role in supporting the future prosperity of our country and our province. I look forward to today's conversation leading us to a better understanding of the behavior of labor changes of today and the years ahead. Our host today is Regg, Cohn, political columnist for the Toronto Star. He is a visiting practitioner in our Faculty of Arts and founder of the Ryerson Democracy Forum. His mission is to bring together the major players across Canada for the kind of democratic dialogue we are seeing here today. Martin, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Lashmi. Welcome to our Ryerson Democracy Forum, where we try to do democracy differently. Our topic today is workers' rights and governments of the right. Can we talk? And really the question is, how does the union movement fight for workers' rights when a party of the right is the government in power and has won a democratic mandate to do what it said it was going to do? And the answer, I think, is that everybody has to start talking to each other and shouting at each other once in a while too. But the essence of democracy is that we have to communicate in some way and have a dialogue. And today we're all hoping to watch how this actually happens with the guests that we have, because that really is part of democracy. So let me talk to you about who's up today. Now, Monte McNaughton is Ontario's Minister of Labour. He's also responsible for skills development. I first met him when he was elected about a decade ago as the MPP for Southwestern Ontario, but he was already a political veteran way back then because he first won election as a municipal councillor at the age of 20. So if you are a Ryerson student and you are over 20, you are over the hill, I think. Our next guest is Hassan Yosef, who is president of the Canadian Labour Congress, which is the voice of more than 3 million unionized workers in Canada. He won the job in 2014, and it was a bit of a stunner, quite an electoral upset. He toppled the incumbent president, who had been his boss when he was vice president, and so he is a living, breathing Democrat as well. His other job is as president of the Trade Union Confederation of the Americas since 2012. Now, Peggy Nash is my colleague at Ryerson, where she too is a visiting practitioner. She's also at the Center for Management Relations, Labor Management Relations, chairing their advisory committee, but she's probably best known as a former member of parliament for the NDP. But before that, she was a trailblazer as a senior negotiator at the Canadian Auto Workers, the forerunner for Unifor. And so she'll tell us a little bit about her experiences back then and her perception today. Now, speaking of Unifor, full disclosure for me, I am a proud Unifor member. because they are our union representing working press in the Toronto Star newsroom. So I am wearing 3 hats today. I'm here as a unionist, I guess, but really a columnist, but most of all, a convener for this democracy forum. So welcome, everybody. If you're feeling outnumbered today, Mr. Minister, by all these people with trade union roots, don't worry, we're not going to gang up. It's a Ryerson Democracy Forum is a safe space, but we're here to hear you out and exchange views. I'm going to get the ball rolling with some questions to warm us up, but I also want to just ask folks in the audience to start thinking up your own questions. Just use the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen and send your questions. Give us your name so we can give you a shout out. And Melissa Wong, Ryerson's Melissa Wong, will gather them up, hand them off, and we will read them out on your behalf. Okay, let's get rolling. And I am going to kick it off by throwing a question to the minister. We'll have plenty of time to talk about this democratic dialogue, but obviously we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so it's no surprise that the first question on my mind and a lot of people's minds is how do we ensure that workers are safe amid COVID-19? How can they stay safe if they have a price to pay in terms of lost wages, if they have to stay home, if they think they have COVID-19 or symptoms? Now, it's no surprise we're going to ask you about this, but it's not just labor activists and journalists and my column that keeps repeating it. You're hearing it from doctors, you're hearing it from employers, you're hearing it from your own medical officers of health who are part of your team. So I've been writing about this forever, no surprises. How do you explain to people that you had to roll back, or you decided to roll back, those 2 paid sick days that the Liberal government brought in just at the beginning, and you've taken us 2 steps back and taken away those 2 sick days? Explain.
Well, first off, it's really great to be here, Martin. I've been looking forward to this for a number of months now. And Hassan, it's great to see you again. I know you and I are in touch on a regular basis. And Peggy, always great to see you and great to be on a panel with you. And I want to thank Ryerson for having us today and putting on this forum. I think it's a great opportunity for people to hear different ideas and hear a conversation. For me, I've been Minister of Labor, Training and Skills Development now for about 18 months under Premier Ford. I really worked from day one to send a signal that my door is always open. I remember I think it was the first 120 days I met with over 100 labor leaders across the province to send a signal that I really wanted to have a dialogue. I mean, look, my mission is to ensure that we're spreading opportunity in every single community across the province. I think organized labor and unions have a huge role to play in that. When it comes to health and safety, I mean, we've really spared no expense from a government viewpoint and expenditure standpoint during the pandemic. I mean, as of this morning, I think we've done 37,000 workplace investigations. We've had to shut down 62 unsafe workplaces and job sites, 7 about 10 days ago, I believe. So, enforcement going into workplaces, preventing COVID from entering workplaces is obviously, one tool in the toolbox. The very first initiative that I introduced and Premier Ford and our government brought forward last March when COVID-19 entered the province was job protected leave. So no one can be fired in Ontario because of COVID-19. If they're in self-isolation, in quarantine, if you're, a mom or a dad staying home to look after a son or a daughter because of the disruptions in the school system, you can't be fired. Furthermore, I eliminated the need for sick notes during COVID-19. And last summer,
by the way, in fairness, Minister, and this all sounds good, but in fairness, you eliminated the need for sick notes because your government had brought back the need for sick notes. That was removed prior to the last election by the last Liberal government with support from the NDP. You brought them back, and then you realized, oops, second thoughts wasn't such a good idea. For obviously, doctors were not happy with that because you're just spreading infection. But it's great that workers aren't going to be fired, but why would they even stay home if they're going to be docked a few days' pay?
Well, I was getting to that. In the summer, Prime Minister Trudeau and Premier Ford did reach an agreement. I mean, $1.1 billion for 2 weeks of paid sick days. $800 million as of last week still left in the bank account. Over 110,000 workers in Ontario are now accessing the federal program. So we did job protected leave. The federal government stepped up with $1.1 billion in paid sick days. I've been having conversation with the federal government quite regularly. The premier and the prime minister have spoken about this. We know there were challenges early on with how quickly those payments were going out, but I'm proud to say now 80% of those payments are directly deposited into workers' bank accounts within 3 days. So the program is improving. I made a decision not to duplicate that program. We obviously can't make small businesses right now pay those sick days out. So we need to make this federal program work. There's 2 weeks available to workers in Ontario.
Okay, let's get some comment here from Hassan Yosef from the CLC. So the Tories claim this is Ottawa that has the money and the wherewithal to do this with this, reimbursing workers sometimes weeks or months later, and it's not like they get to keep their pay. They're not made whole. It's capped at a relatively small amount, especially if you have a decent wage. So, Mr. Yussuff, we know that employment standards is really a provincial jurisdiction. You can't fob that off on the feds. The problem predates the pandemic, and it will persist beyond the pandemic when this federal money is gone. So let's not let the minister off the hook too easily. What's your analysis of what's the right thing to do here? Or does the minister have a point when he says business is tapped out, they can't afford to pay anymore?
Well, first, Martin, thank you for having me, and thank Ryerson for, of course, allowing us all to have this dialogue. I think it's critical, whether it's now or even after the pandemic, that there is public spaces for us to have this dialogue, because I think through this dialogue, we can learn from each other, but equally, we can also debate each other why we have such fundamental difference to the approach that we think in the labor movement, and hopefully find some common ground as to how we move forward to improve the lives of working people, both in this problem, but I think throughout the country. I think the debate about paid sick leave is a fundamental one, because many of the people who are in the front lines, the people who, when this pandemic began, we said, you're the heroes, you're showing up to work, you're the ones that are going to keep the grocery stores open, you're the ones who are delivering stuff to our home. You're absolutely vital and critical, of course, to how we manage this pandemic. And who do we let down the most? These are the people on the front lines, both in long-term care, who are there. By the way, some of them have died on the job as a result of providing the service to the seniors who badly need that service. But in addition to that, they're on the front lines in grocery stores, in all essential businesses that is operating during the pandemic. And they don't have the most basic of protection to ensure, should they have some degree of symptoms, they can actually take the time off, and ensuring they're not going to lose pay. For many of these workers, they're either working for a minimum wage, or in some cases even less than minimum wage, if their employer doesn't treat them as a precarious workers and said, you're not on our payroll, we're going to pay you to deliver that package, but you're not going to be on our payroll to even get minimum wage to begin with. I think fundamentally what the province did do in eliminating what the previous government had brought in as a basic minimum is a fundamental, I think, wrong decision. And I think what has been exposed during this pandemic, of course, how wrong it is. I think the province needs to get back to reality and says we need to have sick days for workers, not during the pandemic, but after the pandemic. If workers have the flu, do we want them to go to work to infect others? I think it's fundamental for us to do that. And the argument that the minister is making, yes, the federal government did step up, but the federal government stepped in because the province wouldn't do their responsibility. They will not change their employment standard legislation. The minister is right, but equally right across this country, all provinces, of course, brought in legislation to protect workers who are, of course, affected by COVID. Should they get sick, they can't lose their job. I think that is absolutely fundamental, but that does not deal with the fundamental question. Why cannot we have an employment standard legislation in this province to provide for paid sick leave? In the federal jurisdiction, there's 3 paid sick leaves in the federal code. In Quebec, there's 2. By the way, it's a jurisdiction right beside us, next door to Ontario. I think we need to recognize this reality, but the people who will be praising and thanking for the work they've been doing to keep us safe and to provide for us in this moment of crisis, we need to stand up and actually take care of them. And the minister and the government need to say, listen, we are going to do the right thing to make sure these workers are obviously going to have paid sick leave. And it's not going to bankrupt the country. It hasn't done so at the federal level. It hasn't done so in Quebec and other jurisdictions that have paid sick leave. But the reality is, I think Ontario is way out of its jurisdiction by simply saying others have to do this to ensure these workers are going to have the basic protection they desire.
Now, Hassan talked about the flu, which will be at us year after year, as will COVID. But let's not forget that COVID-19 is different from the flu, because if you got the flu, you are wiped out, guaranteed. Now, COVID-19 can be much more dangerous, but it can also be asymptomatic. So if you just have a slight sniffle or tinkle in your throat, Minister, why would you take 2 days or 3 days off to get a test if you're going to be penalized for that effectively, even if you get a little bit of money from Ottawa? But a question we're going to save you here and throw the question, a tougher trick question, to Peggy Nash. And Peggy, I wanted to ask you, why is labor relations so weighed down by partisan politics? You had the Liberals bring this in, backed by the NDP. Tories rolled it back. Now we're kind of having a Liberal government doing one thing. In fairness to the minister, a new Democratic Party government in British Columbia has not brought in paid sick days either. So, and they're having better luck with COVID than we are. But so why is it so politicized, Peggy? And why do so many workers sometimes vote for a party knowing that the party has declared in advance that they're going to roll back protections?
Sorry, you gave me the easy question. First of all, let me thank you, Martin, for hosting this forum, and it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. You make a very good point. Remember that Premier Ford campaigned on, as part of his campaign, getting rid of sick pay. And so he did that. And it's very difficult for politicians to back up when they have pledged to do something. They did it. But, you know, before this panel, I was reflecting on Stephen Harper's time in government, and remembering that he came into office after the sponsorship scandal, and how fiscal accountability was his hallmark. And then we ended up in the steepest recession since the Great Depression. And contrary to what he had campaigned on, contrary to all his conservative instincts, he had to invest a lot of money in the economy, which, I mean, there were criticisms from all other parties, but it did help stabilize the economy and helped us get out of the recession more quickly. So what's my point? My point is that Premier Ford campaigned against sick days, but that was when we weren't in a pandemic. Now we are, and clearly the lack of sick days, especially for essential or so-called essential frontline workers, the people who keep us fed and clothed and in good health, these are the ones who are most vulnerable. This is a public health issue. And I guess I would encourage the provincial government. I know there's all kinds of campaigns to reinstate sick days, and in fact to expand sick days because of the deficiencies of the federal program. And I would just encourage the provincial government to think about, conditions have changed, and so decisions can be changed. And why are all these things so partisan? Because life is politics. There's always going to be debates. But I do remember that the provincial government tried to engage working people, tried to get workers to vote conservative. And in fact, there's always been sections of workers who have voted conservative. Some vote Liberal, some vote NDP. I don't think there's any monopoly on workers' allegiance. And I would just encourage the minister to really think about how popular such a move would be with all the people who are the majority of essential workers, and actually majority of workers in Toronto right now who are still going to work. But the majority of those people, the low-paid workers, do not have sick days. And what a relief it would be for people to know they could take a couple of days, get tested, protect their family, protect their co-workers, protect themselves. And as you know, Minister, the federal plan only takes a week at a time. So if you go and get tested and you only need a couple of days, you use up the whole week, or else you go without.
It's not a perfect fit, that's for sure.
Yeah.
That's actually, Peggy, you've actually framed it extremely well, and that's part of our underlying theme is trying to talk to each other. Just for fun, I'm going to throw a trick question back at the minister. Before you were labor minister, you were also a labor critic for the Tories in opposition, and I remember you got off on the wrong foot by going after union leaders like Hassan Yosef and calling them the union elites. Remember that? And union bosses and like mafia bosses. And I used to write Colin saying, you're going to regret this. Why are you using this terminology? And now here you are, Minister of Labor. Probably a Ryerson Democracy Forum is a good place to acknowledge that union leaders like cabinet ministers are elected. So how would you frame this idea of union bosses today?
Well, look, as I said, I've worked really, really closely. I mean, the first year of Premier Ford's government, I was infrastructure minister. Since June of 2019, I've been labor and had training and skills development added to this portfolio. I've worked really, really closely with labor leaders. My motto coming in to becoming Minister of Labor was that labor, business, and government have to work together. And I can point, specifically to how we've worked really, really closely together. In the beginning of the pandemic here in Ontario, I mean, the opposition parties in Ontario were calling for the construction industry to be totally shut down. That would have been 550,000 workers in the province out of a job. And I decided to take a different tact. I picked up the phone. I called all of the trade union leaders in construction and said, how can we enhance health and safety on job sites? How can we prevent COVID-19 from coming on the job sites? And to their credit and to our credit and to the contractors themselves, we all worked together. We came out with guidelines, and really the story on construction has been great. At the end of the year, out of the 10,000 or 9,000 workplace COVID cases, I think 97 were in construction. So that's just one, specific example of working together. But I think of, the training centers that I funded for Unifor in Oshawa, in Thunder Bay, when Bombardier laid off workers, in Windsor, when Chrysler laid off their third shift. I mean, we were there to partner with Unifor to ensure that there were employment services and retraining, literally bricks and mortar built and services provided to those workers. I funded a Unite Here training center for hospitality workers in Toronto. So our record, I really think is really strong. I think we're the party of working class people. I mean, when you think of Premier Ford building transit and expanding broadband to regions where they're really at a disadvantage, to upskilling and retraining, I mean, we're spending historic amounts. And when it comes to health and safety, again, I mean, we're spending more money than any government in the history when it comes to inspectorate, for example.
Okay, so let me and in fairness, you no longer call Hassan a union boss, so that's on the positive side. Hassan, as president of the CLC, Labor likes to give as good as it gets, and a lot of people in the labor movement do tend to demonize the Tories, and as the minister has pointed out, sometimes they win a lot of votes among working people. But the truth is that the labor movement often ends up fighting with every party in power, not just the Tories and the Mike Harris Tories or the Doug Ford Tories, but the Dalton McGuinty Liberals, the Kathleen Wynne Liberals, the Bob Rae New Democrats when they were in power, Rae days. So why is there all that antagonism between government and the labor movement, or is that just a normal dynamic, a natural dynamic?
Well, you didn't ask me to respond to the minister calling union leaders union bosses. And I think it's really disparaging when it happens, because there's no point of doing that. Listen, minister or previous backbenchers or critic for political parties that don't like us call us all kinds of stuff. We're still here, by the way. I think the minister is the minister of the crown, and as such, I have a responsibility to respect his office and try to dialogue with him. there's no question at the end of the day, we need to have respect for each other if we're going to talk in a way that's going to lead us to find a common ground as to how we deal with this. The challenge is, of course, as a labor movement, we have a fundamental responsibility to represent our members. And their priority and their interests come first. And any government that is going to interfere or try to take away things that we have fought very hard to achieve, we're going to respond. And of course, we do challenge any government that, either legislating us back to work or taking away the rights that we think we have really made an argument to advance. And so that leads, of course, to sometimes to these tensions that do happen, regardless of what political party might be in power. So fundamentally, we do have that obligation. But at the same time, we also fight for many of the people who don't belong to our movement. Many of the advances we make in employment standards, or we make in minimum wage and other things that are going to protect workers, not just for our own members, it's for all of society, because everybody is covered by the Ontario employment standards as they are by the Ontario Labor Code in this province. So fundamentally, that's their duties. But I do think that far too often, of course, when you're opposed to government initiative that you don't agree with, you get labeled, and more importantly, you get labeled that to make you as the enemy of the government. And the minister knows this because he sits across the opposition in the legislature. Day in and day out, they're going to hold his feet to the fire in terms of question period in regard to what his actions are in regard to workers. And the minister doesn't find anything wrong with that. He recognized that's part of the system. So why is the labor movement being chastised or demonized for doing his duty to represent his members on a day-to-day basis? I do recognize fundamentally, by the way, regardless of the political party in power, we need to, of course, continue to have conversations with the government of the day, regardless of the political strikes, because that's the only way we're able to advance. I spent 10 years of my existence in the Congress working to expand the Canada Pension Plan. I talked to every political government that was in the country, regardless of political stripe. But when an agreement was reached to expand the Canada Pension, it was parties of the right, parties of the center, and parties on the left who came together to say, we can do this on behalf of Canadians. But for the 10 years, it was a tremendous challenge, but equally it was an important, I think, responsibility to have that dialogue. Had that dialogue not exist, I don't think we would have reached an agreement to expand the Canada Pension Plan in this country.
I think not many people know the extent to which you personally and the Canadian Labour Congress, Hassan, kept the issue on the agenda and held the federal Tories' feet to the fire on expanding the Canada Pension Plan. Not a sexy issue, but a vital issue, especially in an era of precarious work where private company pension plans are not what they once were. Talking about precarious work, I want to throw a question quickly to the minister before we open the questions up to the floor. And again, a reminder to send in your questions using the chat function, and we will read them out. Kathleen Wynne, when she was the premier, again, largely supported by the NDP, as Peggy can attest, raised the minimum wage to $14 an hour and set in law an increase to $15 an hour by January 1st, 2019. And the Progressive Conservatives came in and canceled the $15 an hour increase. And people forget they also froze it at $14 an hour for 2.5 years. 2.5 years just frozen solid in the ice age. Now, in fairness, Minister Doug Ford campaigned on that. Even though the minimum wage hike was quite popular, Kathleen Wynne wasn't. And so minimum wages were lost in the shuffle. But the world is changing, and now you have Joe Biden in the White House, and he is pushing forward with a $15 minimum wage. And that's in US dollars. So in Canadian dollars, Canadian currency, that's between $19 to $20, depending on the exchange rate, an hour. And we're going to be stuck at 14, or now it's, I think, $14.40, a bit of an inflationary adjustment. And so we're like the Alabama of North America, maybe an exaggeration, but you campaigned on open for business, but it feels like we were closed to the idea of a decent living wage, especially as Hassan has argued, when we are coming to understand the importance, some people, of essential workers and the core economy. So why frozen, Minister?
Well, as you know, Martin, that was a bit of an exaggeration. We actually have the third highest minimum wage in the country. It'll be heading to $14.35 or $14.40 this fall. But also, I mean, the one thing you didn't mention, we did eliminate income taxes provincially for anyone earning 30,000 and under, I believe, which was, I think a balance between the small businesses and workers. But I can tell you, our mission is to ensure that people find good, meaningful jobs. This is what strengthens families and builds better communities across the province. Prior to the pandemic, for the first time in, I think it was a decade, wages were actually going up in Ontario. Family incomes were going up. We were heading in the right direction. We're going to get back to that, I'm certain, coming out of the pandemic. What we're doing, what I'm doing in our ministry is, for example, getting more young people into the skilled trades. I just met a gentleman a couple of weeks ago. His name was Chris. He just became a steam fitter. He grew up in Toronto community housing, and he told me he was surrounded by crime. He's making $48.68 an hour now as a steam fitter, and the province funded part of that program. We funded the pre-apprenticeship program. So there's good things happening. And, when it comes to the minimum wage, I don't want people just getting minimum wage jobs. I want them to aim higher, and us as a government to ensure that we work to spread opportunity. And again, I tell this to every labor leader that I meet with, labor is going to play a key role in helping people advance.
Yeah, but the minimum wage, and I don't want to harp on this because we're going to try to just land some points here and let you ponder this. The minimum wage also is a floor that helps to give people a living wage at other levels, and it also protects people who are not blessed, if I can be biased here, with the protection of unions. Union members tend not to be minimum wage earners because they have more negotiating strength, bargaining power, and so it's really for the most vulnerable and yet the most essential workers. But let me shift gears here last question before we throw it open to some really interesting questions coming from the floor. I want to ask Peggy Nash to talk about your own experiences in the labor movement. You were a pioneering woman in what was a man's world, and to some extent may still be, rising to become a senior negotiator at the CAW. Tell us a little bit about the obstacles that you faced, not just perhaps dealing with big bad bosses, not union bosses, but employers, or the tough negotiations, but also the tough negotiating the obstacles perhaps within the union movement that you might have faced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, things have changed quite a bit since then. In fact, the union that I come from is now called Unifor, and they now have a woman who's the number 2 officer in as Secretary Treasurer. So that has taken a lot longer than some of us would have liked to see, but I think there are changes taking place. But Hassan knows this from our union as well, that for many years there were a number of us who were pressing for changes around policies on harassment, human rights, anti-racism, developing women leaders, Indigenous leaders within the organization. And I mean, some of this work began, in the post-war period. Some of this work began from the UAW in the United States. And but there have been decades of progress in this area, lots more to do. But I think that's something that a lot of people don't know about. I think what my experience in the union was, yes, was very male dominated, although most of at least the national leadership and many of the local leaders were very enlightened. Sometimes it took some persuading, but became enlightened. But what it really allowed someone like me to do was, and for so many members in the union, is to learn about the world and to develop skills that help you better represent workers. Anybody who has been elected to go to the bargaining table and who's able to bargain a collective agreement and see, we're having all these discussions about sick pay. but being able to negotiate paid sick pay. And someone in the questions was saying we should differentiate between sick pay and weekly indemnity, because if you're off for, usually if you're off for a longer period of time, it's an insurance, a weekly indemnity, which is different than sick days. But the changes you are able to make in people's lives, that people are able to make in their own lives, is really very exciting. And you know, something that strikes me with Minister McNaughton, I mean, I read some comments that you had made before you were the minister in opposition about speaking favorably about right to work states and really kind of undermining unions. And I'm hearing from you today that your thinking has evolved from that, which I think is really positive, because I don't think unions get enough credit for the social advances that they make. And, you know, when we go through the whole Me Too era, I mean, some of the policies that we had negotiated in the union, anti-violence policies going back to the early 90s. And I just don't think it's widely enough known. And I remember even the Toronto Star calling labor leaders, Bob White, going back to that era, calling labor leaders union bosses. So,
Yep.
you know,
Peggy, it happens. I'm embarrassed to admit that it even happens in recent times, not just way back in Bob White's time, even 2 or 3 years ago. Forgive me, I'm not going to stereotype here, but a young reporter who probably has heard the phrase on TV all the time said union bosses, not in an opinion column, but in a regular news story. And I called the desk and we changed it. So mea culpa collectively for the media. Hassan, can I just quickly, before we shift to the floor, because we have a lot of questions coming, Hassan, tell us a little bit about your own experiences in the labor movement and as a person of color, dealing with a movement that was not just male dominated, but white dominated, and you rose to the very top. How did you do that? How did you survive? And what did you encounter along the way?
Well, you know, the labor movement is a tough culture to survive.
Oh, Hassan, can you perhaps move the microphone a little closer? Because I'm not sure we're hearing you all that well. Yeah.
Sorry. I said the labor movement is a pretty tough culture. And if you are fortunate to get the support and to make the leap, it's still a fight. And Peggy, no different. I think it's still a huge challenge for women today, as it is for many people of color. There have been many changes, of course, still happening in the labor movement, but I do believe we've got a long way to go to be truly a representative movement at the leadership level. In the ranks, clearly you can see from those who are joining the movement, who populate the movement, they're very diversified today. Half the workforce in this country are women. And the movement knows fully well it's got to embrace more issues that affect gender and women in society. But equally, I think we've got to do a better job in regard to how we deal with diversity and race in our labor movement. I certainly, as an individual, have been fortunate at a young age to got involved at 18 and pretty well had to go through some of the hard knocks of getting past the barrier. I remember somebody telling me that, you know, it's not your turn, you need to wait till your turn. And I remember, I don't know what it was, whatever that came out of my head, but equally I said, could you tell me when so I could set my watch and come back and when that appropriate moment was? But that was the kind of things that you would hear from people. Listen, racism, sexism, stereotypes of people are still part of our society. Until we eliminate this in society, we're not going to eliminate that in the labor movement. But I do believe the efforts and the ongoing commitment to say we need to do better is going to do that. I was able to get to where because activists and leadership supported me, not all the time, but for most of the times when I ran for secretary treasurer, you know, there was somebody else running. I succeeded in winning that fight. The difference is no different when I ran for president. Equally, it was a very healthy competition, but at the end of the day, but again, it was a lot of white workers who supported me in that position, knowing fully well if I was successful. But I recognized a long time ago, just because one is successful in his or her career, it doesn't mean you don't open the doors a little bit wider and make space for others. And what I've learned at the end of the day, you've got to continue to encourage how we can do better as a labor movement. This is a fundamental challenge we saw most recently with the Black Lives Matters movement and the Me Too movement. Are saying we need to do better as a society. And I think the labor movement itself has to, of course, step up on its game to ensure the representation that we have in leadership represent the diversity of our movement. And that's no different in government as it is in all other affairs of life. So we need to do better. But fundamentally, I think the point that you made earlier is that there have been barriers, and I think we need to do a better job to break them down. And how do we, of course, do that in a way that build a better movement as we're trying to build a better society in this country.
Interesting. And I'm going to open it up to the floor now. Minister, I rescued you from a comment that Peggy made, but I want to circle back to that for a second. And it is interesting that the progressive conservatives were flirting with the idea, we're experimenting with the idea of right to work laws. And I think it's let's all just breathe a sigh of relief that the Tories saw the light and circled away from that. And now the minister is marching in Labor Day parades. Minister, just very briefly, how did you decide to go away from that direction and into the direction of marching on Labor Day?
Well, I will let you know, Martin, I was actually the labor critic when we dropped that policy. That is factual. And of course, that was almost a decade ago. I think we've had a couple leaders, or maybe three since then. Look, I just think back to before I was in politics. I mean, our family had a home hardware store. I'd be out at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, loading lumber and drywall and building supplies for people. Some were union members, some weren't. And I just came to this job knowing and believing that all of us have to work together. And, you know, again, I talk a lot about the skilled trades, but we're going to solve the skilled trades shortage by having unions really helping us. And, you know, they've got great training centers across the province. So we really all have to work together. And that's been my belief. I mean, Hassan, I want to publicly thank you, because you and I have had a number of conversations. I mean, Hassan has, you know, offered advice to the Premier. That's the collaboration we need. It's going to build a better society, and overall, it's going to help families and build better communities.
Okay, good answer there, because I think it helps people understand that there's a lot of shouting happening and a lot of name calling, but there is also a dialogue that happens at the same time. Here's a question from John Cartwright. Minister, why won't you implement the legislation that will make companies that use temp agencies financially responsible for workplace deaths and injuries that involve temp workers? It's been passed, it's just waiting for signature. Fiera Foods has had 5 temp agency workers die in their workplaces. Won't surprise you that I wanted to flag that question from Mr. Cartwright, because the Toronto Star has done a lot of great work on that issue. Thoughts?
Absolutely. The Toronto Star has done great work on this issue. I mean, I remember the former government doing this literally at the end of their term. We brought in a number of changes, making temp agencies pay proper WSIB premiums based on the status of the worker and what you know, job that they were doing. So they're paying the appropriate rates. I can tell you clearly, I'm going to address this issue. I'm going to do everything possible to crack down on temp agencies and to protect workers across the province, especially those hired by temp agencies. There are some bad actors out there. Those are the ones that have to pay, and we'll be dealing with this very soon.
Okay, this is a subject that's coming up again, perhaps given that our audience is confronted with a precarious workplace. So Peggy or Hassan, question asked a different way. Temporary contract work has been a big problem in Ontario's labor market, one of the most important and visible dimensions of precarious employment. Does the government recognize, so it's addressed to the government, but perhaps the two of you can give us a different dimension on this. Does the government recognize the precarious employment as a problem? If so, what will the government do to tackle this problem? To Hassan or Peggy, what can or should the government do to tackle this problem? Because otherwise Monte will just tell us that he's on it.
Well, I think fundamentally this is an issue that is, when the first precarious work sort of a concept starting to be talked about, you know, there was not a whole lot of people. Today, during this pandemic, I remember having a conversation with Bill Morneau then as a finance minister. They're trying to figure out, how do we provide programs that are going to help all these people that are going to be, you know, basically out of work or told not to go to work because of the situation they're in. And then there was a recognition how many people are in precarious employment in the country, not just in a particular province, but throughout the country. this is a fundamental question both the minister and his government can take care of, because it's a question how you define the employer and how do you find the employee under employment standard legislation. How could you work for some of the biggest corporations in the world? We know who they are, the Ubers, we can go through the list of them, and have them tell that worker that you don't work for me, you work for somebody else, you're working for yourself. And I think if the legislation that the minister have responsibility were to clearly define who the employer is, ultimately that employer would have responsibility to that worker. Those workers will be covered by employment standards. They will have to be paid the minimum that employment standards provide for, but equally would bring dignity to those workers where they're not trying to scrape ends, make ends meet to try to survive. And more importantly, like the Ferrero Foods, when a worker get injured, to tell the families of that worker who lost their life, no, you work for an employment agency, rather than say, no, this is a responsibility of that employer, because the worker was working in their workplace. They didn't work off the street, they're working in the workplace, and that employer should have this is about basic dignity. And to have this happen in a 21st century economy, to me, it's really crying out for the kind of leadership that we need. And the pandemic, I think, has made it absolutely clear. We need to do better. I think not only in the province of Ontario, but right across the country, we can do better by amending our employment standard law to make sure these workers actually are under the system of employment standards.
Anyone else want to pick up on that?
I'll jump in and add, Martin, I obviously I agree we need to have some basic standards. And Minister, am I right in understanding that you're going through a review right now of temporary work, and that there is an opportunity there to maybe standardize and provide some transparency for workers, but for society in general, in terms of who these temp agencies are, what their record is, and to provide some kind of basic guarantees, some basic minimums for some of the most
vulnerable,
who are in the most precarious situation already. Maybe they're new to Canada, or they're just very low income, and having some minimum standards would really go a long way. So I think you have an opportunity right now with your review, and that would really clear up some long-standing problems, and I think help us with our public health issues right now.
Yeah, I
Minister,
agree.
the floor is yours.
This is a long-standing issue, and we will be addressing this very, very soon.
Okay, there's a clue. We'll watch for that one. And in fairness to the minister, we're not trying to be too fair here, but this is a vexing issue, a challenge that faces governments of all political stripes, and the changing world of technology and accountability by employers who try to duck is not as easy as it looks to fix, but the problem is impossible to ignore. Here's a question, though, that's related maybe from Andrew Chichotsky, if I've pronounced it correctly. What do each of the participants think about the recent successful unionization attempts at large tech companies in the US? Do you think the same might happen in Canada? Hassan, why don't you start with that?
Well, of course, workers who don't have union representation in the tech companies, unionization in the United States is a classic example. Most of the times these workers don't think, in some cases, they don't need a union, but there's a recognition, of course, that they're no different than other workers. They're vulnerable to exploitation from their employer. And more importantly, of course, we know that workers in many different aspects of work in this country are also joining the labor movement on a continuous basis. And I think what happened in the States is only a question of time before it'll extend here in Canada. But equally, my colleagues, of course, who are representing workers in this sector will have to reach out to those workers. And sometimes it's a multitude campaign that goes on year after year to make sure the workers know that the union is available, of course, to represent them, and more importantly, will help them deal with some of the challenges that they encounter with their employer in their workplace on a regular basis. So I think what's happening in the United States, by the way, in Europe, in many places, these workers are unionized. So it's only a question of time, I think, workers will see the benefit of unionization in our own country.
Okay, I'm going to jump in and go to some more questions rather than doing a round robin here so we can hear more from the audience. Much of the examples in the discussion have revolved around private sector workers, but most union members in Ontario and across Canada, as we all know, actually work in the public sector of schools, hospitals, universities, and so on. Can you guys talk about the differences between public and private sector unions and how this dynamic shapes the relationship? I think it's an interesting question. I am pro-union, but I am also painfully aware, having been on a couple of strikes and being a picket captain, that when you're in the private sector and a union member and an employee, you're worried about your company not going under. This is even before the media was dying in a death spiral. Newspapers would close after long strikes. If you're in the public sector, let's be candid, you don't have to worry about your employer going out of business. So there's a different tension in the relationship. Hassan, why don't you take that trick question?
Well, you know, quite often, I think Canadians, not as in general, but to a large extent, don't appreciate the important work that the public sector do on our behalf. And this pandemic has reminded all of us that how important those workers, by the way, it took about 3 weeks for the federal public sector workers who work in the federal bureaucracy to work with the federal government to help design a system that could help get the CERB checks out that went out in the millions to Canadians right across this country. They're on the front line, of course. The reality, of course, for those workers, their employers sometimes could be equally as harsh as private sector employers in the way they treat them or wage restraint that they would bring in, as we know that's in Ontario right now. And I think we in society as a whole need to recognize the important service these workers provide for Canadians as a whole. But equally, yeah, there are some differences. Their employer is different, but to a large extent, I think there's a recognition that their employer is not as mean or sometimes restrictive in regard to wage constraint and whatever. I think those workers go through equally the same challenges with their employer. And fundamentally, I think as a society, we need to recognize how important public service to all of us, because it's a great equalizer in this country. And fundamentally, we need to show more support for these workers, because without them, many of the things we take for granted, hospital care right now, getting your vaccine when it's available to you, of course, all the things that public sector workers are doing and testing us and what have you are coming because those workers are there regardless of what they're paid, standing up, doing their job to ensure we are taken care of. And I think there need to be a greater recognition of the important role they play in our society. But more importantly, their employer could be equally as challenges as private sector employer. Our membership today in the Congress, I would say about 82% of our membership is public sector versus private sector, which has dropped significantly. It's overall is about 18% of the overall membership of the labor movement.
Minister, you might want to tell us that one of the first people you reached out to was Smokey Thomas, president of OPSEU, the biggest public sector union in Ontario with over 130,000 members or so. Your perspective on the public sector and the private sector union movement.
Yeah, I guess two things on this point. Martin, I agree with you. It's interesting when I talk to a lot of private sector union leaders, they often will talk about, the financial health of the industry and of the businesses. I mean, it's important to them that these businesses do remain healthy and able to hire their members. So I'd say that's one big difference. When it comes to public sector unions, and Smokey Thomas, he was one of the first ones I reached out to. In fact, I just talked to him a day or two ago. I don't know if you know, but we hired more than 100 brand new Ministry of Labor inspectors. It's actually the most inspectorate in Ontario's history under a Conservative government, I might add. And Smokey was really instrumental in helping us achieve that, as well as, the pandemic pay for healthcare workers. I mean, Hassan talked about, these heroes out there that are, literally keeping our families and loved ones going throughout this pandemic. A lot of the public sector labor leaders, in particular, Smokey was a big advocate and worked with the government to make this happen. I mean, the Premier was really committed to ensuring that these healthcare workers got that pay boost. But again, we worked in partnership with a lot of these labor leaders and their members. So again, there are differences, but ultimately, I respect the fact that they are representing their members, their men and women.
Peggy, any thoughts on that? The public versus, the public, as Hassan has suggested, the public sector unions now essentially dominate the union movement in Canada. And as much as many of us may love the union movement, and I think you made some good points about the social progress that has come about as a result of it, unionization historically has been on a downward trend in Canada as in the US. There's been some blips, but it's not a great trend line.
Yeah, Martin, but I don't think that's because people don't want to join a union. We saw with the Foodora workers where they had to fight like hell to just get the right to hold a vote, whether they wanted to belong to a union. And they finally fought that out at the labor board and voted over 90% to join the union. And then Foodora basically decided they didn't want to deal with the union and left town. And sadly, that's what has happened with so many private sector workplaces, that it has become just so overwhelmingly difficult for workers to get into a union, and it has really been challenging for organizers. Organizing for people to join a union is very tough work, because a lot of the time, even though it's against the law for a worker to be fired for trying to organize a union, in many cases, people are led to believe that you can join a union, but you're going to lose your job. And I would argue with the public sector that many of the changes that private sector employers have brought into workplaces that have increased outsourcing of work, insourcing of work, just really tremendous downward pressure on wages, benefits, and just squeezing labor costs. Now, I'm not saying that in either public or private sector unions that people have not been able to make progress through collective bargaining, but there has been tremendous pressure to reduce labor costs. So you see, even in the public sector, growing number of contract workers, growing number of temporary workers, people in more precarious work, side by side with other workers who maybe have access to a pension plan and maybe have those paid sick days.
Yep.
So many of those same techniques have come in, but I would argue that we don't need fewer workers in the public sector organized. What we need is to strengthen the ability of working people in the private sector to, if they so democratically choose, to join a union.
And it's got to be said that that was one of the impulses of the previous labor reforms that took place after extensive study, and it tried to take account of the fact of how hard it is to organize unions when you have, you know, small franchises and companies that have these satellite workplaces. It's not like the old days where you had one big office or factory you could organize, and a lot of that was whittled down. There's a question here from Ramesha, which echoes a question from Emily Wilson. What does the provincial government plan to do to help migrant farm workers access health benefits, especially during COVID testing? And let's just broaden that out to protecting, and you're from Southwestern Ontario, Minister, protecting the health and safety of migrant farm workers who generally are not unionized, obviously.
Yeah, great question, and the timing really is appropriate. I mean, there's about 700 or 800 migrant workers in Ontario today, but we know that number is going to grow over the coming weeks and months to about 21,000 on farms. I just launched a blitz. Literally a couple hundred inspectors are going to visit many farms. I mean, we did 1,000 so far. It'll be well over that this time. And this time they're actually going out with translators to ensure that the workers are able to communicate with the ministry inspector. I've been crystal clear, labor laws in Ontario apply to every single worker, regardless of their passport. Furthermore, I speak regularly with a good friend of mine, Marco Mendicino, who's the federal minister responsible for immigration, citizenship, and refugees. And he assured me that the federal sick day program will apply and does apply to migrant workers. So we're inspecting the workplaces. The federal government, which is responsible for the temporary foreign workers program, they have inspectors going out, and they're also partnering with local public health units to inspect living quarters and bunkhouses. So really, it's a concerted effort of all levels of government working together, but they're protected by the labor laws here in Ontario, and they're protected by the federal benefits as well.
So we've gone into a little bit of, we were supposed to end at 5, but with the prior agreement from our panels here, we're going to go into just a little bit of overtime for just a couple more minutes, unpaid overtime. So let's hope the Ministry of Labor does not fine us for this.
Just going to ask that actually if Hassan negotiated for all of us.
Right. So yeah. Question here from last question, in fact, that we have time for, though, from Myers. You know, I talk about Myers so often. I always avoid pronouncing his last name, so forgive me. Our professor emeritus at Ryerson, Myers Samatsky. Question to the minister regarding work in long-term care homes, nursing homes. If you were now the opposition critic for Labor, and the Ontario government of the day had the record of working conditions that we're seeing in long-term homes, what criticisms would you be making of the incumbent government? Trick question from Maya here.
Yeah, well, look, we're so focused on, the long-term care situation. Obviously, many families suffering, and they lost loved ones, and of course, the workload on the staff is horrendous. I know, again, speaking from our ministry, I mean, we're in helping protect the workers in those long-term care homes. The Ministry of Long-Term Care has inspectors on the resident side. Again, we were really critical of the former government. The Premier said this, and the minister responsible. We have been critical of the staffing issues that have been around here in Ontario literally for decades. We just begun fixing those, and of course COVID hit, but $1.6 billion more we've invested, and I know locally here we just gave the long-term care homes in my riding an extra $1 million to help with PPE and sanitizing costs. So it's a sad situation, but I can tell you it's all hands on deck to help the long-term care homes.
Hassan, do you want to give the minister a little bit of help here? He used to be quite a tough opposition critic, but he's getting kind of soft on himself now.
Let me help him a bit. I think it's really important, given what we have seen this crisis of exposed in the long-term care, that the care for the people who have helped build this country has been adequate, and has been adequate for quite some time. It's been now exposed, so we can't pretend anymore. But I think this is also an opportunity to set some standards in this sector right across this country, and Ontario could be the leader in that. I think the government has done one very important thing. They recognize that minimum care for seniors in these long-term care are critical. But more than that, what about the people who are providing that care to our seniors in these long-term care? The numbers of seniors who will be in long-term care are not going to diminish in any way, given the aging population we're dealing with. This numbers will increase over time because more and more people are going to require to go in care. I think the government can, of course, set a floor for wages for these workers. Why are these workers competing in this sector? We need to set a ratio, full-time versus part-time workers in this sector. Yes, of course, and how do we help the workers maintain their skills and, of course, improve their skills as they continue? This sector will also innovate, it will have technology, but fundamentally, the government also have to see the disparity. The majority of people who are doing this work are women. They're mostly women of color. And we need to recognize the differential treatment that they're receiving is simply inadequate. And the government can say, listen, the time for reform, we're done talking. We are going to bring in some standards in this sector, because ultimately, if we're able to do that now, we'll ensure for the future, and as the sector will continue to grow, we'll be able to do better when the next crisis comes, that we will no longer have to. Many of these workers, by the way, have gone into this sector knowing fully well they're putting their lives at stake. I think the least our government can do in the province of Ontario is to say, we're going to do our part to ensure you never have to go through what you've gone through during this crisis. Inadequate personal protective equipment, not having your hours guaranteed, not able to make a decent salary while we're asking to provide care for the most important citizens of our province, the ones who have helped build this great province of ours. So I know the government need to think about it. I know they've got a commission looking at the issue, but fundamentally, I think we need some action, and the time for that action is sooner rather than later. And of course, the federal government says they're prepared to come and work with the province. Right. They've actually have money on the table to say, if you're prepared to set some standards, we'll work with you. It is in provincial jurisdiction, but ultimately the province got to provide the leadership. And I will thank the minister if he can be an advocate to ensure his government can do the right thing to make sure we can lead in this direction. Ultimately, the whole country needs a similar leadership to ensure we can reform the sector once and for all to make sure our seniors will have better care of the outcome once this pandemic is over.
Well, there's a really interesting opportunity and some strong advice from Hassan Yosef. We are out of time for questions, but I'm going to sneak in one quick last request for the minister and for the head of the Canadian Labour Congress. If you have any advice for me, for Peggy, for everyone at Ryerson who thinks about lifetime learning and training and retraining, just a very quick piece of advice about the world of work that either one of you might want to offer us.
Well, look, I think there's so much opportunity out there. I know the one statistic prior to COVID I was using, obviously it's changed a bit now, but every single day in Ontario, 200,000 jobs were going unfilled. Many of these jobs are good, meaningful jobs with pensions and benefits. One of the things I'm really proud of is the launch of the Second Career Program in Ontario to help those people that have been displaced or put out of work because of COVID-19. We've introduced training that's going to be 12 months and under. We partnered with universities, colleges, and private career colleges to literally get these people who are out of work into a training program close to home for a meaningful, good job close to home. So that's my pitch for retraining and upskilling. It's a key part going forward.
Martin, like it or not, the world of work is changing every single day. And fundamentally, I think workers are going to need ongoing reskilling and new skills on a continuous basis. And I think as a society, both in this province and throughout the country, we have to provide a mechanism where those workers can get those skills while they still have a job as work that they're doing and work that will change, will help them, of course, be better able to deal with the challenges that they're faced with. And this has to be a way of how we have to view training and retraining for workers. We have to build it into the system, make it a right for every worker to be able to access that training, but fundamentally make it easy for them also to take advantage of it at the same time. As a union leader, I know my skills are changing all the time, and fundamentally, it's not a question what I want to. The reality of the world that I live in is changing all the time, and I've got to continue to recognize that I also need to learn new things. Is the way how I do my job, and be available to make myself relevant to the challenges that our movement is facing by leading it, but also encouraging government to make sure they can make this possible. Because if we're going to compete in the world in which work will be a fundamental, I think, important for working people, we also have to equip them with the skills that they need to ensure they can build a better life, because they do want to build a better life if they're given the opportunity to do so.
Okay, quick last word from you, Peggy, about that.
Well, I'm someone who's had to reskill a couple of times. And so the last time involuntarily. And
that's politics.
That's politics. But in fact, in retrospect, I'm glad of the opportunity to try and do new things. I think what so many people underestimate is the capacity and the potential and the creativity of the average person, who often we see limited by their current job. So the supermarket cashier or the Amazon delivery driver have lots of ideas and creativity and potential skills, but in most people's lives, they don't have the opportunity to develop those. I think in Ontario, we're so lucky we have a strong post-secondary education system. I'll give a plug to Ryerson, which is doing so many new and creative initiatives. And we also have our colleges and training institutes. But I think it is an economic strength for the province that we have this opportunity to have such a skilled workforce and people who are able to live full lives. So anything we can do to enhance that makes people more creative and adaptable in a changing world.
Okay, before I thank our guests, I would like to just invite our audience to tune in next Tuesday, February the 9th, when the Faculty of Arts will be hosting a panel on women's leadership during COVID-19, including Ontario's Regional Chief, Roseanne Archibald, and Toronto's Medical Officer of Health, Eileen Davila. So please put that in your calendar. And also just a personal invitation to join me for a talk that I'll be giving on the 24th of February called The End of Travel and Why It's Time with COVID-19 to Revisit the Future of Mass Tourism. It's based on my travels as a foreign correspondent across Asia and the Middle East, but it's really about the culture of travel, lots of stuff to talk about, hosted by Ryerson's International Issues Discussion Series. So you can join us on February 24th, 6:30 p.m. Please make a note in your calendar. You can go online. I've got it up on my Twitter or Facebook feeds, and that'll take you to the link where you can register. My Facebook or Twitter is @Regg Cohn. So that's my promo. Okay, that's all the time we have. So on behalf of Ryerson, I'd like to thank the Minister of Labor, Monte McNaughton, for venturing into the lion's den, even though we're all just pussycats here. You got a lot of credit for that, a lot of tough questions and a lot of tough issues as a cabinet minister that you have to defend. Thanks also to Hassan Yosef, president of the Canadian Labour Congress, and also for being a good sport, and also to my Ryerson colleague, Peggy Nash, for bringing her insight here today. Thanks also to our president, Dr. Mohammed Lashmi. A special thanks to Dr. Pam Sugiman, Dean of the Faculty of Arts, and Melissa Wong, who is Director of Strategic Operations, for sponsoring and helping us out on the Ryerson Democracy Forum. And thank you to Monte McNaughton's daughter, who is joining us just now for a cameo. Hey there. And thank you to everyone in the audience for listening today. I hope you'll log into our future events. Stay sane and stay safe, and see you on the 24th, I hope. Thanks, everyone. Be well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Martin.
Thank you for being here. And we have future students. I just see future students.